Well, thanks for coming. And thank you to the Society for Contemporary Art for having me. It's really nice to be here. So language is the subject and primary material of my practice, of my work. It is also, I've found, a kind of prism through which I can interrogate any other topic. And struggling with the duality of language, its potential for sense-making and connection, and also as an extension of us as our creation, and its inevitable failure, remains the basis for my making. Before we actually look at some of the older work and some of the newer work, I have a desire to tell you why I keep coming back to language, why I adore it, and why it exasperates me daily. But I also want to do this without actually talking about myself at all. This is what Maggie Nelson calls, in her essay, Writing to, from, and for others, her preference for thinking with others, the weaving together of others' words and mine. It's the preference for the language of others. So let me try. I have two ways. The first is this. In 2013, Ta-Nehisi Coates traveled to France. He actually rooted himself in France for the entire summer. And he sent back these dispatches, what he calls dispatches from France, where he's trying to master the language. Every single morning, he's in classroom, trying to understand the language, trying to understand the place through the language. Every afternoon, every single one, except his departure date, he's studying on his own. And in one of these dispatches that he sends back to be published in The Atlantic over that summer, he titles it, Or Perhaps You Are Too Stupid to Learn French. Yeah? And in it, he writes this: I understand why people see a place without knowing the language. For most of us, if we waited on fluency, we wouldn't see a lot. But knowing even the rudiments of language is part of the act of seeing the place. It makes a city four-dimensional. And struggling with the language, which is what he did, and what I think I do, is part of the act of knowing a place. It makes a thing four-dimensional. Let me try another way. After the 2016 election, so early 2017, I added several books about the dystopian post-apocalypse to my nightstand. Yeah? As I'm sure you all did, didn't we all? I was looking for the language of the end, or at least an end, or how do you name the end of things, right? And what follows, because we're still here. But eventually I actually went backwards and I chose the Odyssey. It's a new translation in 2017 by Emily Wilson. She's the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English, 2017. And this text of homecoming and exile and strangeness among intimates is actually exactly what I was looking for. What's interesting about this text, though, it's an epic poem of Nostos. It's interesting on its own. What's interesting to me is that after 400 years and more than 60 translations, there are still discrepancies in the text. There's this expectation, at least from me, that the text would be a kind of settled law by now, and it is not. The first line of the text is actually where we find the heart of most of the contradictions throughout that poem of Nostos. So here's how it's been translated to date, from positive to negative. What that first line is trying to get at, as you know, is who is this man? Who is Odysseus that we're about to follow on this journey home? And here's how he's described, from positive to negative. He's ingenious, adventurous, crafty, clever, versatile, prudent. He's a hero. To the negative, he's cunning, he's shiftless, he's restless, tossed to and fro by fate. Emily Wilson finally says, he was a complicated man. I know. And in one word, she encompasses 400 years before her. In one word. Tell me the story of a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost. Tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. It's a beautiful first passage. So while the value of language has not shifted in my practice, the reason for it has. And every once in a while, I find it's incredibly helpful to find the beginning. So in 2012, I'm originally from Alabama. I went to school in Alabama, actually the University of Alabama, and then I moved out to New Mexico for a couple of years. And I found that I longed for and missed the South and home more than I thought I would. So I came back to Atlanta, actually, for grad school. And in grad school, I was making grad school kind of work. It was representational. It was about race and identity. I made a paper bag piece that was about colorism and the paper bag test. And the critiques that I was getting around this work were much less about the work itself and much more about the speaker's attempt to understand something about my own racial makeup. Yes? And so I started to take that language from critique and make that the work itself. So in response to that paper bag piece, what I heard in those settings was, don't you think your work is a little elitist because I don't know that history? Or, maybe if you make the paper bag into a slave ship, then I would get that it was about race. Or, I just don't see race. I just don't see color, so I cannot critique this work. And the language was the problem, and I didn't know how to respond to it. I'm not a good first responder. I'm really good the second time, but not the first time. And so in order not to internalize that language, I started to paint it, to draw it, to obsess on it in these panel works. So this is what I call the white noise series, and it's the first time that language enters my practice. The title of the work is, Do People Ever Think You're White? Also something that was said in critique, or rather asked. And so what you see in the background of these chalkboard works is me writing that language, that question, across the surface. Do people ever think you're white? Do people ever think you're white? In that kind of punishing, write it till you learn it kind of way. That then is erased. Some of it is even washed away. And on top of that punishing text in the background, that same question is rewritten, but now deconstructed into these tiny letters. People used to tell me that they looked like maps, they looked like snowflakes, they looked like blizzards, they looked like all kinds of things. But they're white noise, and so you can read almost anything into them. This is Unrelated from 2012, part of the same series. My rule for this work, because I'd never tried a kind of work of abstraction before, was that I would write it until my hand hurt, and that's how I would know the piece was done. Because otherwise I could obsess on these works into oblivion. There had to be some sort of limit to my own obsession. Well, they just don't match up from 2013. This is actually based on a story that was in the news about a stranger calling the police on a family of different. It was a mixed family, black and white family, and the stranger thought, well, they just don't match up. And what starts to happen here is that the more I dealt with this language, that was the language of others, in an attempt to get this language outside of my body and outside of my practice, to not, in the words of one of my grad school peers, make it into a slave ship, and then I would get it. So that I didn't follow that advice. That deconstruction helped me to understand the intent behind the language itself. And by the end of that process of obsession and being able to call it white noise, there was something really satisfying about also being able to make something beautiful out of what started off as a problem. But the more I obsessed on the language, the tighter I became. It's not like that I was able to let it go at the end of the piece. It was just ruminating over and over again. And so you start to notice that the structure itself starts to break apart, right? Until it breaks apart here into 96 small panels of chalkboard. I think I was longing for a little bit of spaciousness to enter the work. Eventually, what I tried was to write these white noise pieces over and over again and then to erase them with those old school felt erasers. They have whiteboards now. They're much less magical. But the old school eraser holds all the residue from what came before it. And then you clap the erasers together, or I did, and the dust would kind of emerge from it. And I would photograph that dust. And I was looking for a kind of way to let this series go, to let this obsession go with other language, problem language. But that actually didn't come until this work. So this is Gray from 1984. What's interesting about the definition of gray is in 1984, this snippet of text designating an urban area deteriorating into a slum is only there in the 80s American Heritage Dictionary. It's not there in the 70s. It's gone by the 90s. American Heritage. There's something about that text and that decade that it feels indicative of the moment and this place. The color gray, designating an urban area deteriorating into a slum. It doesn't last long. So the process here is taking these dictionary definitions, usually from American Heritage, sometimes from Webster's New World. It's really good colonial language embedded in the dictionary. Writing that across the surface, rewriting the text on these bright white American Masters is the name of the paper. And then using my spit to erase everything but what I want you to be able to read, what I want to be able to control and leave legible. That led to this Contranym series and the spaciousness that I was looking for in the white noise works. Contronyms are words that contain their own opposite meaning. There's like 88, I think, in the English language. Not all of them are interesting. Dollop is a contronym. It means a lot of a thing or a little of a thing. It's not poetic at all, but some have poetry. Quiddity is still my favorite contronym. It means the essence of something and a trifling nothing. It is everything and it is nothing. And that feels like I could be talking about race and identity or 10 other things at the same time. So these then are diptychs. The opposing definitions always rest side. They're framed separately, but they have to be installed close to one another because I want the contradiction to abide itself, always. Whether that's in tension or at peace, at rest, they have to abide. So it's a little bit of a close-up so that you can see when I'm putting the spit to the page and erasing, it's actually eating into the top surface of the paper, and that falls beneath it. It says protest from 1953, to state positively, to assert, to speak strongly against. It does both of these things. Flesh from 1982, also a favorite. Flesh is mankind in general, humanity, or one's family, just my kin. Everybody, or just the people that I like, or maybe don't like, it depends. Comprise from 1982, to consist of, to be composed of, to include, and contain. Like to hold the thing or to be contained. And this then is what falls beneath the works. So that residue of the pink pearl erasers, the American Masters paper, ends on saliva, all of that falls beneath it as I'm erasing, and I scoop it up into a little pile, and it becomes its own sculptural work. What I'm still intrigued by here is that the works retain the title of their origin. So this piece was bound, the contronym for bound from 1968, and it is still bound. Its essence is still the same. It's just shifted form. Find from 1982, using a black magic eraser instead, so it becomes much more funereal. What's also interesting about find, particularly in American Heritage Dictionary, is that the idioms become interesting here. So you could say anything to give find context. I found my keys, made my day, right? The dictionary is full of not just definitions, but also idioms to tell you how to use the thing. Instead, 1982 American Heritage, the idioms for find, they're super violent. The burglar will be found out. The liar will be caught. The jury will find for the defendant. Something about the death penalty. Over and over again, I read through the entire text, there is a kind of leaning towards violence, retribution, and the justice system in a way that is absolutely not necessary. And there's something really interesting that it's American Heritage in the 80s where this happens. This is also, just as an aside, really interesting year for dictionaries, super controversial text. For dictionaries, this is the one that everybody wrote about. So this year, American Heritage 1982, Scalia was on the contributors board, Maya Angelou, Carl Sagan. This was the year that they invited non-linguists to join the board. The most controversial person who the dictionary got the most flack for inviting to join the contributors board and decide what words will be included in the dictionary was a cartoonist from the New Yorker. Everybody was like, why? He uses so few words. And they're like, that's why. He uses so few words. Efficiency. So for Find 1982 here, the length of it is intentional because I was erasing not just the contronyms, those opposing definitions, but all the different idioms leaning towards violence. And so it stretches across, I think it's about 13 feet long. And here's a little bit of a detail so you can see it up close. becomes a sentence, I think. And once I noticed the idioms, I wanted to come back to them. So these are still contronyms. This is Bound from 1968. But what's left legible is not the opposing definitions, but more of their poetry, right? The illustrative sentences. What's legible then here is the ends of the earth, the end of his rope. And they're as far away from each other as possible. So these exist on one sheet of larger paper. This is a Somerset Radiant, I think it's Radiant White. Yes, it's Radiant White. This is Temper from 1968. What remains legible is to lose one's temper or to keep one's temper, both incredibly possible. Fine from 1982. I tend to read this right to left, although it's out of order. I'm fine, and you. And they're as divorced from each other as they possibly could be. I cannot help but think. I cannot help thinking. The Statue of Liberty signifies a haven for the oppressed, or crossing our borders represents aggression. Both of those exist within Mean from 1982. And Where from 1982. Where are you from? We know the when, but not the where of it. So this is my Southern Review series. I'm originally from Alabama. When I moved to New York for the Studio Museum residency, Thomas Lax had curated a beautiful show about Southern art, Southern artist, and how does that definition get made and accepted? And what does it mean to be a Southern artist? That kind of question today. And so people were coming through that beautiful show and they were coming upstairs. They knew a little bit about my biography. And so I kept hearing this question over and over again when people came to the studio, which was, oh, how does it feel to be a Southern artist living in New York? And they always did it with this shoulder shrug that made me really uncomfortable because I didn't know how to, I'm not a good first responder, and I didn't know how to answer that question. One, it threw me off, but two, I've never thought of myself as Southern. I think of my work as rooted in the South and in the history and memory of that place. But Southern to me, you say it, and I have an image that doesn't fit my body. Right? So I found this Southern Review journal. It's been published since the 1930s out of Louisiana State University. Poets and writers tend to know it more than visual artists. It's a very prestigious literary journal. And even though it's called the Southern Review, it often has nothing to do, the writers have nothing to do or not writing about the South necessarily. But the title was tantalizing, this possibility of like checking in with the South, checking in with what does it mean to be an artist from the South now, a review. So I took the journal and ripped all the pages out, decided which ones I wanted to keep, and then filled in the body of each page's text. So titles untouched, page numbers, headers, footers, authors' names, all of that is untouched by me. All I'm dealing with is filling in with this super soft, velvety charcoal, the body of the text. That then felt like a way to respond to the question, and also by reordering the review and by allowing my fingerprints to kind of sift across the surface of the page, that it became a kind of response to the question, but also my own interpretation, my kind of control of the narrative of what does it mean to be a Southern artist. I'll make it mine. I did a talk in Birmingham with Natasha Trethewey, who's from Birmingham. She was a poet laureate, I think a couple years ago now. And I said, I've never thought of myself as Southern, and so I'm making this work. She said, the work is beautiful, but you should absolutely call yourself Southern. She gently checked me. Because if you don't rewrite the narrative of what it is, you'll let everyone else do it for you. You should claim it. It was good advice. Every once in a while, an image will pop up, and it complicates the role of like the photograph and the blanked space. To me, the black space that's filled in with charcoal is incredibly filled. It's not censored. It feels full of a different thing. It's become its own different form. But when a photograph exists, it almost implies that what should have been under the space was a photograph, and it's not, and it somehow becomes really complicated. I mean, also because what we tend to know of as Southern art is landscape photography or a kind of folk art, and so the existence of a photograph is another kind of complication to me. And these are just some pullouts from the Southern Review, detail pieces. Interestingly, in 1985, the Southern Review had an editor change. And so the editor's note at the beginning of the journal says something like, we haven't had a lot of African-American writers up until now. Here they all are at once. It's an entire issue of Black writers, and it's really good. But it's also a kind of corrective edition, an admittedly corrective edition. And so in 1985, I had a hard time following the system that I had set up for myself for this issue. I love a system. I love a good rule set. And to break the rules still makes me incredibly uncomfortable. It hasn't happened since. But I would try to follow the rule. I'll fill in the body of the page's text. But then there's like Amiri Baraka, and why do I need to fill in the body of the text? Yes? He's already doing the work of challenging that question of what does it mean to be a Southern writer. It doesn't need my intervention. And so it's a lot cleaner of a text than exists before it and after it. These are a few details. Another aside, the first few pieces that I did in this series, I was throwing away all the rips and tear pieces when the tape would rip the entire page in half. When my fingerprints were getting all over the surface of the paper, I threw those out. And then I realized that's the good stuff, right? It's the messy work of rewriting a narrative that makes that actually grapples with the question more than the clean work. But speaking of clean work, so this is a pattern or practice from 2015. In 2015, the Ferguson Report was released. And I remember reading an article where they interviewed a professor out of St. Louis who said reading this report was like being told that water was wet. It's like, of course you knew it, but if we've all been denying that water is wet for a really long time, it's somehow a relief to know it. This is the document then where it's the investigation of the Ferguson Police Department and all of the events leading up to Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson. It is an incredibly meticulous, detailed document. And as painful as it is, it's also a beautiful document because it is rare that we know all the reasons leading up to a thing. And in this one officious 100-page text, it is all the reasons leading up to a thing. So what my process for this work then, well, first was to avoid it. I like a text with a kind of historical distance from it. This was incredibly recent, and so I backed away from it for a while and started researching prior DOJ documents and reports that had come out. And what's interesting is the 1968 Kerner Commission, right, which is the kind of investigation of multiple incidents across the U.S., not just one city, has all the same reasons and all the same suggestions for curing the reasons, and we followed none of them. And so I came back to the Ferguson Report because it felt like I was just running away from a thing to get to it anyway. So the process for this was to blind emboss the text, all 91 pages. It's actually longer than that, but I excluded the conclusion pages because they were so similar to a document that came out 40 years prior. So blind embossing then is forcing the text to protrude from the surface of the page. It almost becomes like a braille. And I show it unframed, which tends to make some galleries and museum spaces nervous, but to me that's the whole point. I want it to be fragile. I want you to want to touch it and to be forbidden from it. I think there's part of this piece and part of the document that you actually don't know unless you can physically understand it, unless you read it with your body. But to be forbidden from that is another layer to the work. Desire and rejection from it. The text is legible, but it's hard on the eyes. If you haven't noticed, I like to control the language. I like to control what you can read and what you can't. Language feels, back to exasperation, feels so often out of my control that anytime I can make you as frustrated with language as I am, I feel deeply satisfied in the work. I'm serious, deeply satisfied. It's the Birmingham News. So this as well as blind embossed, but here's the first time I tried a new process with blind embossing. It is to twice emboss the work. So this is the work that's upstairs. So in 1963, the Birmingham News editorial board decided not to publish any civil rights stories that were happening locally. The most kind of evident example of this is when the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, even the Montgomery Advertiser published the iconic photographs, police dogs, fire hoses, hundreds of children being arrested down the block from the Birmingham News. Everyone else gave it front page importance, above the fold, multiple photographs, signifiers of value. The Birmingham News, where these events are happening, published these stories. Sophia Loren is sick in bed and can't make it to her movie shoot. They had a reporter go to the zoo. It's a nice zoo, the Birmingham Zoo, and pet a snake. And they wrote an entire story about how he pet the snake, and a photograph, and the snake is like around his neck. Instead. So for these works, I actually went to the archive and looked back through the cover pages of the Birmingham News from 1963, particularly during the spring months. This is the spring campaign. And during that time, the Birmingham News was not publishing any civil rights stories on their cover pages. Every once in a while, they'd publish it inside the newspaper, but even then, it was reported incredibly stenographically. So facts, figures, no interviews from anyone who was actually there. The twice embossing, then, of the cover pages forces the page to fall apart. This is an acid-free kind of newsprint paper. It's not as strong and durable. It's not as heavy a weight as the paper for the Ferguson report. And so soaking the paper twice, pressing it twice, re-registering it twice, all of that repeating, the paper doesn't hold up under it. This was the first work that I made after the 2016 election, and because it felt like it felt like we were repeating the past. It felt like we were back in some part of the 60s, and I wasn't sure what institutions were going to hold up under that pressure. And so the paper itself doesn't hold up under the pressure. Here's a detail of the work. So the legibility is still there. It's still hard on the eyes. And then parts of it you'll never know because the paper's falling away or disintegrating. And the photographs have been removed. I'm going to mention these briefly to get to another work. So this is Colorblind Dictionary from 2013. It actually took me a year to make. And I erased every single mention of color from the text. It took me a year. I hated the piece when I was done. I still haven't resolved my feelings for it. But it took a reading of the dictionary to make the piece. It was an incredibly laborious process. And now every once in a while, someone will come up and say, did you see blue on page 63? And I'm like, I don't want to talk anymore. Black and blue dictionary, for this work, I erased every single mention of black and blue from the text. So here, the piece to me, the difference between these two, is that this work becomes to me a little bit more poetic, right? Because black and blue evokes so many other meanings. The blues, a bruise, a kind of damage to the body. But this is my book. So this is America, a Hymnal. I made it in 2017. Yeah, that's true. Did you know that the lyrics of Amazing Grace existed 60 years before ever being wed to a particular tune? It's interesting. Actually, a lot of our early American songbooks were printed without any musical notation whatsoever. It's a kind of lovely assumption behind, it's economical. You can print it without having to use so much ink. But also there's an assumption of shared knowledge that we'll know the music, just give us the words. It's also a kind of privileging of word over song. If you didn't know the words, oftentimes the whomever was giving the song would give the line out, line by line, to the congregation until they could recognize and repeat. There's all these different ways of thinking about the importance of word here. For America hymnal, this text is actually made up of 100 different versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee from the 18th to 20th centuries. So the song that we know today, My Country 'Tis of Thee by Samuel F. Smith, was actually written in 1831. What precedes it is the tune. It's actually the tune for several other national anthems. They're escaping me now. I think it's 6 other countries have the same tune as My Country 'Tis of Thee as their national anthem. But the 100 different propositions here, the 100 different versions of the same song were written for all different causes, and oftentimes contradictory causes. So the suffragettes had their version. The temperance movement had way too many versions. Abolitionists had these beautiful, sorrowful, mournful versions set to the same tune, and so did the Confederacy. And the juxtaposition of those feels, so American. So for this text, I printed out all 100 versions and then burned away the music. So what's left, what's legible, is 100 different propositions of what it means to be American without the song to unite them. There's nothing holding the text together. The burn of the page scorches across the surface of the paper. It's also still, what's that word? You can smell it as you page through. And every time you read the work, it will fall apart, right? The kind of end of the piece, because the notes have been burned away, as you turn the page and then they group back together into the book, they get mercilessly, you know what I'm saying, tangled together. And so the more the piece is read, its end is kind of embodied in the work itself. It won't last forever. And then these are my lost pieces, also made after the 2016 election. So at first I was looking to this literature of the post-apocalypse for the language of the end. How do you name when the world has ended? At least the world you knew has ended, and we're still here. Micah Perks has a beautiful book, What Becomes Us, and in it he describes the end of the world this way. The hem of the world has ripped open. The seam has broken. And things I cannot fathom have fallen through. N.K. Jemisin writes in the 5th season, The End of the World, this way. Usually when we say the world has ended, it's a lie, right? The planet is fine. But this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends for the last time. I enjoyed that language, but it wasn't enough. And so I started to broaden the kind of category of text that I was sifting through. This is Total Eclipse by Annie Dillard from 1982. And what's left legible? I'll read it. Obliterated meaning itself to tell anyone. For what is significance? No people, no significance. Name the substrate, the ocean or matrix or ether, the unified field, our complex and inexplicable caring. This is remarks on the outcome of the election. It's actually Jimmy Carter's concession speech. So I was looking for text that we're talking about an ending, although not necessarily the end of the world. I have not lost either love. Actually, what you can't see is under there, it's what's also left legible is laughter. It's the reporters laughing. No Name in the Street from James Baldwin. As futile as it is inevitable, fault. The pulpit, the church, and home. Deliberate repudiation of everything, but no. And Speech Sounds, a beautiful short story by Octavia Butler. Repeat, now what? Repeat the gesture. Stand by and watch. Push things that far, both hands empty. Ignoring the whistling and applauding of two. It's actually a story about the loss of language. And then these came next. So in 1988, Edie Hirsch published a book called Cultural Literacy, Things Every American Should Know. Also caused a bit of a scandal, but it was also a national bestseller. So in it, he makes the argument that we need a kind of cultural language between us in order to feel like we belong together. And in the index, there's a list of 5,000 things that, according to Edie Hirsch, if we all know them, then we will belong. We will at least feel like we belong. In that list of 5,000 things, there are 9 patriotic songs listed. And so I am making a painting for each of the 9 patriotic songs. Thy Name I Love is actually a lyric from My Country 'Tis of Thee. So this is the first painting in the series. It's also the same red as America, a Hymnal. And if you notice, it's the same process as the White Noise series, much earlier in my practice. For each of these paintings, what I'm pulling out is the lyric that feels like in this patriotic song, this kind of national hymn, there is still love language. And yet I'm making it into a kind of noise, again, by writing it over and over into illegibility. So this is the first piece. It's different than the entire rest of the series. It changes here. This is I Am For You, and the song is Grand Old Flag. It's old, but I've always heard it old, like O-L-E, Grand Old Flag. So the text changes here from white to black. White noise is like TV static. Black noise is actually pure silence. So not only is it illegible, it's now also silence. The song literally cannot be sung. The colors that follow this work is the hymnal in shadow, all darkening and losing that vibrancy of the first. This is a detail of I Am For You from Grand Old Flag. Who More Than Self from America the Beautiful. And You Know Who I Am, Ballad for Americans. Yeah. This is Do You Know Them from 1898. So what I'm bringing back here the process of blind embossing twice so that the paper falls apart. Feels like for slightly different purposes. The text here is actually classified ads that were placed in predominantly six black newspapers in the States after emancipation. So the texts were people looking for their loved ones, formerly enslaved people looking for their loved ones. And what you start to notice is because as these classified ads become more popular, their reach is farther. And also, these ads started to be read because they were published in the newspaper. Not everybody was getting the newspaper. Not everybody could read. Pastors would actually read these texts and these ads from the pulpit, broadening the reach that maybe you could find your people. And what you start to notice as they pick up and become more routine, more popular, that the language of them, how you ask for your people, starts to repeat. So these works from 1898, the repeating refrain is, do you know them? Do you know her? Do you know him? Do you know them? Over and over again. It's always at the top of the classified ad. And then underneath is as many memories as one has of the person. They're usually scant. Every once in a while, someone would find their people. It was rare. The twice emboss here feels, I made this piece after the child separation crisis at the border, and it feels like we are repeating the past in all kinds of different ways. And so the falling apart of the paper feels right. The phrase that started to pop up in the 1890s, only the 1890s, was, can you help me to find my people? We're not sure why. It's gone by the 1900s. These ads were actually published all the way until the 1920s. So 1860, actually a little bit before 1865, all the way up until the 1920s. People were dedicated to finding their family. and then the Odyssey. So I mentioned that first line of the text has been translated at least 60 different ways. That contradiction doesn't stop on the first page of the Odyssey. It exists throughout the entire text. For this series, I focused on book 13. So this is the moment when Odysseus, 20 years away, weeping and seeking and longing for his homeland, finally stands on the shoreline of his own home, and he doesn't recognize the place. And so within book 13, and this kind of falling action of the plot, there are some beautiful contradictions in translations. So this is the Odyssey from 1852 on the left, and the Odyssey, a different translation from 1980. What's left legible is the same Greek translated, right? The same line translated two different ways. So what land is this? What people? What men are born here? What country, what land is this? Who are the people that dwell in it? What men are born here? Who are the people that dwell in it? It's a very different question. The Odyssey from 2000 and 2017. So on the right will actually be Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. It was his homeland he missed as he paced along the whispering surf line, utterly forlorn. Other translation. So weeping for his homeland, he went limping along the shore of the loud, roaring sea with many a groan. There are at least 10 different ways that the water is translated differently. It feels like if nothing else, we can agree on what the water was doing from the Greek, and yet we can't. It's the deaf rocks, or the tumultuous, deep-voiced waves, or the whispering surf line. There is no consensus in most text. And the Odyssey from 2000, 1980, and 2001, all the same passage. It's so small. I think this one is, and tell me this so I will know. But tell me this so I can feel assured. But tell me the nature of things around here so that I can judge for myself what I have fallen into. How is that the same thing, right? Tell me this so I will know. But and then that really long line. It's a completely different text. And then this is the last piece I'd actually like to show you. I'm really good on time. So I've started a kind of research into floriography. This is the language of flowers. The language of flowers enjoyed a resurgence in 19th century Victorian England. There were, I think, between 1827 and 1923, I think those dates are right, there were at least 98 different flower dictionaries in the US alone. And these are not typical definitions of what does a flower mean? A rose means love. It was more Victorian than that. The camellia means my destiny is in your hands. The iris means I burn for you. I am your captive. I think Delaware is the peach blossom. Yeah, I am your captive. So for this project then, this is the inside of what's the chapel space like here that looks like you're forbidden from it if you venture around the little wall. There's actually a flocked wallpaper that's based on the language of flowers. Do you remember flocking? It's like the felty, yes, remember flock, good. So I took all of the state flowers for states in the American South and translated their meanings. And then I paired them with states along Great Migration routes and translated the state flowers of those places as well. And I created a kind of, to me, what is a love letter to my home, a love letter to the South, which feels like it is equal parts beautiful and violent. Let me read it for you. My destiny is in your hands. Let me go. Justice, you are cold. I think of you constantly. Do not refuse me, my bane, my antidote. Take care while I'm away. I burn for you. Justice, welcome me. There are, I think, 3 major tributaries, kind of paths of great migration, routes that people would take. Mississippi and Chicago was a very popular route. Alabama tended to go a little bit farther to the east, but 3 major tributaries. So the pairing of these flowers is actually a bit more personal than I think I first said. It's all the states where my family lives in the South, and it's all the states where my family fled the South, left the South, chose to leave the South. And pairing those up creates a kind of poem and love letter to each other. There's a detail of some of that flocking. The dimensions of the piece will shift. So in Miami, the chapel space, the wallpaper surrounds the walls. It becomes this kind of enclosing of white on white wallpaper. At the Smart Museum, it will actually cover the length of a 50-foot wall. The dimensions will change, but there will always be 300 camellia petals, which is a kind of way, to me, to memorialize the number of documented lynchings in Alabama. There will always be 300 camellias. My destiny is in your hands. Illinois is let me go. Thank you. Can I answer any questions for you? That means I did a really good job. Sure. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Do I get to pick?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Using the eraser ends up looking like a Gaelic language, and other kinds of foreign language you're aware of, obviously.
Yeah. I've heard it before. I actually, I'm monolingual, so it's not familiar to me, but I have heard several other languages. And what I think is interesting is people see the language that they're most familiar with or not familiar with at all. It tends to be one or the other. Thank you.
So a lot of your work is clearly very rooted in place, both as a notion and the sort of physicality of the space that you're in. And I wondered, do you notice your work or the way that you approach your work change based on where you are? I know that you recently did a residency in California versus being in Chicago, or if you're off-site researching, do you find that you approach your work differently based on your immediate surroundings at that juncture?
It's less immediate. I think I tie it back to, and maybe we all do this, I have my eye on this fire station. My partner won't let me, but I have my eye on this fire station in Montgomery, Alabama, where I'm from. It's already converted. It has this beautiful studio on the bottom floor, and the top's converted. I would have to do nothing to it, and it's so cheap. And I think in that way, I have this longing for home, and yet I know I'm not going to move back there. And so I compare every other place to home. Yeah. When I go back and work in Alabama, I've done some projects there. It is a kind of clarity of why I'm making. It's like it burns everything else away, and I remember why I'm doing this thing. And then you leave, and there's a kind of spaciousness that enters the work, a kind of possibility. It's less confining. But only in relationship to home do I judge or respond to other places, I think.
I am.
Mm-hmm.
Is it on? Yes,
Hi.
It is. Hi there. First of all, thank you. That was incredible to share so much about your work. It's really still digesting it. But we've seen so many instances in your work where you sort of reflect on the loss of language and sort of changes in it and sort of meaningful moments in it as well. But there's also another form of language sometimes in sort of the title of your work, which are numbers or years, actually, to be more specific. I guess the most simple version of my question could be why? Do you want to anchor it in time or sort of in a certain history? But also maybe to complicate it just a little bit, I'm curious, I mean, sort of American hymnal seems this kind of like allegory of language changing over time. And sort of when you go through the book, it really has that sort of allegorical feel that you are sort of inside and outside of history at the same time. Whereas in this other work, you're situated in 1963 or in 1898. And just maybe also to reflect a bit on the differences between the titles and the meaning of the years and time in relationship to language.
You know, I think every project is a kind of investigation for myself. There's don't they say the places where you grew up, you rarely visit. It's like when you go to other places, do you actually go see these things? There's so much about the civil rights movement and the history of Alabama that I know but didn't know. And so when I went to the Birmingham Library and sifted through that microfiche, first of all, I felt like Julia Roberts in the Pelican Brief, and that was very fun. But it's also a kind of, I want to remember, I want to mark the moment. The moment seems important. It's important conceptually that you know it's the spring campaign from 1963. It's also a kind of reminder to it's like a thing I learned, a thing I knew but also learned. I think that has something to do with the dates. America, a hymnal, feels like an outlier in a way to me. There's something about it that doesn't fit within my practice and still excites me. And it does have to do with that accumulation of time. This is a kind of roundabout way to answer that question. The piece I'm thinking of next, I tried it in Miami, but I have an idea to try it again, is actually a day-long singing of America, a hymnal. I grew up in a very liberal Presbyterian church in Montgomery, Alabama. I have to say Montgomery, Alabama. It's the whole thing. But we used to do these 48-hour Bible readings. And so you would sign up for your hour, day or night, and you would come and read the text. I've also heard of people doing this with the Odyssey, I guess you could make an argument that the Odyssey is a sacred text in a way. But you would sign up for 3 a.m. and you would read the text for an hour. Sometimes people would be in the pews, oftentimes not, and you would be reading to no one. And what felt valuable there is whether you were present or not, was knowing that a sacred text was being read into the world again. So America Hymnal, doing a day-long singing of that, it actually takes about 3 hours to sing through the text. The time here feels important because to do it for 24 hours, you'll have to sing it back and forth. Right? It becomes this kind of like slingshot to me through time. It's not an answer. That's a poetic answer to your question, I think. We'll see.
First of all, wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for coming. I have 2 questions, if that's
Okay.
So the first one is that clearly you're fascinated with the ephemeral. I'm curious if you have considered your practice in the time of the internet, with Twitter language, Black language in and of itself is constantly changing, Urban Dictionary, and these kind of technological readings of how our society has changed. And the other question is that I'm curious, obviously we have conservationists to preserve these works, but since you seem fascinated with destroying them, I'm just curious if you're ever worried that someday your art won't exist, or what other practices you've considered just while doing these sort of readings. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. So the first question, no. I think I'm a little older than the generation who's like, oh, that's not true. I'm on Twitter all the time, but I don't think about the technology of it. It doesn't have the same resonance for me, I think I just missed that. The second question, the work is falling apart, but it's always caught in a state of failing, right? So the Birmingham newspapers works, they have disintegrated. They've fallen apart in the process of making them. They will not fall apart more. They're actually stronger than they look. I can touch them, don't touch them. I can touch them. And they have a kind of heft to them, even now. The chalkboard pieces, I would spray those and not tell you, so that there's this kind of danger implied in being next to them and possibly elbowing them, but they're fixed. I like that kind of forever failure. Right? It's never fully gone. It just exists in a different form, or it's permanently caught in a state of falling apart. That state's really interesting to me. Yeah, thank you.
I know text and speech are two different things, but there's kind of this threshold between them, which is the intake of breath. And you hang on to that. And especially in your newest painted works, especially using chalk dust, atmosphere becomes part of it. The text enters this cloud state, it becomes vaporous or atmospheric. Do you ever think about those moments in between where we start to translate either from speech to text or vice versa, and how even the corporeal becomes involved, that text is embodied and kind of entering a different dimension?
That's a good question. They are so close. I only ever think about speaking when I have to give talks. It's actually, I never think about it in the work. Because speech to me is when it's on the page, it becomes somehow officious, and I can grapple with the officiousness of it. Here, this is so, what you've heard will be different than what you have heard, and we will all go away and say that we've heard maybe different things, or how we heard them is different. And that feels so unwieldy to me. I also grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. I grew up being in a biracial family, and I grew up being observed constantly. And so speaking to me is a kind of performance that I refuse to actually let, I am not interested in it entering the practice, right? Speaking is being watched, it's in a way. And maybe that's not true, and maybe it won't be true tomorrow, but it's true today. But in thinking about the body in the text, yes. My spit is in the Contranyms, it's in the Odyssey, it's in the lost pieces. Whether you know it or not, when the work is in the museum or in your home, so is my body. When I make the white noise pieces or the red noise pieces, the undersong, what I call them, paintings, the rule is I'll do this until my hand hurts, and then it's done. There's actually oftentimes laboriousness and obsessiveness and a pain to the body that to me makes the work valuable to me. It's how I know it's finished and how I know it's worthy. And that has, everything to do with the body, mine. I love that question about the breath. Yeah.
So maybe this is with regard to that question, the last question to go, but one. Clearly, it seems this is going on in my head as I'm listening to you. You have a love of words, you have a love of language, but you're also censoring, to some degree. And we're all buried in language now, all day long. Back to that Twitter idea. A whole heck of it probably ought to be censored or repurposed, and you're censoring and repurposing, in these works, it seems. Mm-hmm. As you now think about all these texts that are just coming to us from everywhere, do you have thoughts about that, just the larger way that language is being used, words are being used, which you put to such beautiful purpose in the works that you've shared with us?
Well, I think implied in your question is a kind of authority to censor, as if I have some sort of control over what others can read. I know the irony of me saying that because I said I love control and controlling what you can read, but it's not like the Odyssey doesn't exist in its form, you know? It's like this is a form of the Odyssey. It's not the Odyssey. And so I actually never think about censorship. Maybe that's also a rejection of the authority of language. I don't want to be in charge, you know? That's really true. Yeah. I don't want to be in charge is going to be the last thing I say. Okay.